Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's October 19, 2020, and today we are talking bamboo, soya beans and East Himalayan food systems with Dr. Dolly Kikon, an anthropologist at the University of Melbourne. Hello, Dolly.
Hi, Luke. Thanks for inviting me. It's fun to be here, and I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming on the show. To kick us off, I think you have a legal background, and you've written extensively about militarization, politics, resource frontiers, and oil in northeast India. So when and how did you decide to pick up a scholarly interest in Naga culinary culture in food?
That is an excellent question, and thank you for asking me that. Food is very central to our lives, human lives. And I belong to the Naga community, an indigenous community from the Eastern Himalayas. I've written a lot of things in my life, and even through my legal training, one of the important things that I have advocated is really the quest for justice, knowing that I come from one of the world's longest running armed conflict in the world in the northeast region of India. I started thinking about food as an adult. I graduated out of law school. So I started my career as a human rights lawyer, and I spent a lot of time documenting human rights violations and state violence. One of the things that came to my notice as I was documenting human rights violations among my own people, the Naga community, and also the neighboring states, whether it was Assam or whether it was Manipur, there was a pattern that began to emerge. And that was really about how crops were burnt down, how granaries were burned down, how livestock were taken away as a part of the counterinsurgency operations. I never thought that I'll ever start writing about food because, to be honest, starting my journey as a human rights lawyer, I was very invested for many, many years, for around 10 years or so after I passed out of law school, to really look at perhaps quote unquote serious and hardcore stuff. Food became so important as I embarked on this journey, because not only was I looking at a landscape, as we would go for fact-finding trips to villages, images of destruction, of crops, of orchards, stories of being deprived of food. If you have read any stories or any accounts of interrogation, of custodial torture, one of the things that the state does in order to extract information from you is deny you sleep and food. These experiences very early on in my life played a very central role in helping me think about ourselves as citizens, as human beings, as neighbors, as survivors of very bloody conflicts around the world. And how is it that something that we take it for granted, like food, becomes a lens to think about human experiences? That's when I started thinking about the concept of pathos. Very early on, the first fieldwork notes that I wrote after my PhD fieldwork in 2011, that's when I finished my fieldwork. So there was a call for papers, short essays from the American Anthropological Association newsletter. And they had a theme called Breaking Boundaries in Anthropology. And I was very interested to see what kind of boundaries I was going to break as a student of anthropology. And I ended up writing this short essay called Tasty Transgressions. If you Google it, you can find that essay in the American Anthropological Association newsletter even today. And as I was talking about conflict, as I was talking about political economy, as you know that my first book is on extraction and militarization in the Northeast, I began to see the entire landscape through taste and through food. And I had no clue, right, that I would end up writing a book on extraction. The data was just all over the place. And in our training as an anthropologist, I think the key thing in ethnography is that we let the stories and we let perhaps the field speak to us. Through my training as a lawyer and then into my transition as an anthropologist, food really followed me like a shadow. And it's taken me, I would say, around 20 years to come to this point in my life where I am feeling that I'm ready to write about food, but not as something quite purely from the framework of celebration alone, but from the lens of pathos, of struggle, of resistance, of what is it that brings us together and what is it in human society that can rip us apart, and why is food so important? And even as I say that I'm an anthropologist who works in Northeast India, I am surely part of the larger South Asian conversation that's happening. And if we look at Indian citizenship and the Indian experience of the marginalized, the Dalits, the Adivasis, and the tribals, food is very central to look at our experiences of humiliation and our experiences of violence, even to the extent of being lynched to death because of what we eat. So I feel that today I am ready, after 20 years of my experience looking at pathos, food, looking at torture, to be able to tell a story.
Well, thanks, Dolly. That's a really great overview of the career journey that you've gone on to get to this point and your particular interest in pathos and resistance. Before we get into that kind of thing, I just want to go into what it is that Naga food actually features in a tangible way. And the reason for that is that you don't encounter Naga food very often in Myanmar, and you certainly don't in Australia. And I thought that a good opportunity to do that comes in one of your papers. So you quote this British journalist's characterisation of Naga food, which was published in the UK's Daily Telegraph newspaper. So I'll just read out that somewhat ridiculous characterisation. Quote, Naga food delicacies include roast dog, snake kebabs, silkworm curry, pig skin in various recipes, steamed hornet, snail stew, bison cooked in dog blood, and we've even heard that Nagas enjoy eating whole frogs. A woman who we met protested, no, not frogs, tadpoles only, I think. So this is an easy characterization, an endless site of carnivorous indulgence to reject. But if we just reject it, then we're ignoring the ways in which food and consumption play a significant role in normalizing everyday expressions of repulsion and enchantment. These are expressions commonly used to characterize ethnic minority groups. So I'd love it, Dolly, if you could expand on this, maybe counter it, and tell us the unique and interesting features of Naga cuisine.
Thank you for reading out that line and, in a sense, offering me to explain Naga food. This is surely a very, very racist and a colonial way of understanding food, right? And understanding people and their history. But to flip the coin, it's also this hypocrisy that's there when you look at him. And he's clearly a tourist in Nagaland. Just trying to figure out what food is. He has this idea about the Naga people and what they eat, and he ends up writing about, his fantasy. But on the other side, also perhaps is this idea about the quest for authenticity that's there among Westerners who travel to this part of the world. So perhaps this is what I want to say, putting it right there up front in terms of this kind of colonial fantasy and the search that continues even till today. The central part of your question regarding what is Naga food and how do we understand it, let me just put it directly. I think Naga food is one of the most visible, quote-unquote, ethnic food right now in India. If you think about Northeast India, which constitutes of 8 states today, Naga food, I would say, is one of the most visibly stylish and consumed food. You can find conversations about bamboo shoot, about akhuni, which is fermented soya beans, all over food blogs. And I think some of India's top chefs are so excited to discover and to explore what it means, in a sense, to have a Naga ethnic plate. So you can look at the Taj, Bengal. In Kolkata, you can see some of the Marriotts, the 5-star chains across India, having actually now Naga food, right, in their buffet. Naga food, and how did it come to have this kind of visible and such a cosmopolitan, vibrant presence in India, starts with 1997. 1997 is the time when the government of India and the Naga armed groups signed a ceasefire. And it's the third ceasefire since India's independence, from the 60s to the 70s and now to the 90s, the third ceasefire. What happens with the third ceasefire? And let me say that it's the 23rd year of the ceasefire. It's one of the world's longest ceasefire negotiations right now. I say that as an anthropologist, perhaps to provoke, but also maybe to start new conversations, that one of the most successful outcomes of the Indo-Naga ceasefire was actually Naga food and the rise of Naga cuisine and the visibility of food and what we do with it outside. And that in itself is linked actually then to the out-migration of thousands of young people across the Naga homelands and its neighboring districts like Arunachal Pradesh, like Manipur, like Mizoram, Meghalaya, Assam, right? It's around that time after 1997 when other armed groups as well from the region fighting for the right to self-determination joins in to sign a ceasefire agreement with the government of India, trying to find a political solution. As the out-migration happens after that time, with migration and mobility, the young people who go all across India to work in the hospitality sector or in education or to find employment carry, among other things with them, food. And as they settle down in different cosmopolitan cities across India, from the north to the south, what they start to do over a period of time in the last 23 years is to have small cafes so that they can run small businesses, is to make sure that the shops they open cater to the other migrant communities who are coming from the northeast to work and then to study. And this in itself is a hugely, hugely transformative moment, because in my own life, after my high school, I went to Delhi to study, and that was in the early 1990s, before the ceasefire. You could not even get dry bamboo shoot. Forget about getting fermented soya beans. Right? You could not get any kind of ethnic food across India. Even till today, you go to any supermarkets, they will not keep any food from the Northeast because it's so different. And, you know, as somebody, perhaps as an anthropologist yourself working in Myanmar, you see the contiguous landscapes and you see the map and how is it that our food and taste are so similar. And so when you look at beyond the Gangetic plains, the food habits and perhaps the cultural and historical ideas about what constitutes food in the Eastern Himalayas is almost invisible. So after 1997, it's this great transformation. And today, the vibrancy about Naga food is really then connected as an anthropologist to two things that are missing in the conversation. And this comes back to this gentleman's idea about fantasy of this wild tribes who are just consuming and devouring nature, right? Everything that's moving. And that's not only a colonial fantasy, that's also, let me say, a casteist fantasy that's there. That tribals, Dalits, Adivasis in India eat all kind of wild stuff. Where does this racist and this casteist notion come from? Where do these kind of perceptions come from? It comes from a disjuncture in understanding what is sustainable for us as indigenous people from the land. What do we eat? What is perhaps jhum cultivation? How many people understand jhum cultivation, which is also known as slash and burn? And if you come from communities like slash and burn cultivation, how is it that seasons are so important to us? This is fantasy that whether it's Naga food or any ethnic food for 12 months of the year, we are just eating like crazy. I see that here in Melbourne, actually, not in the landscape that I come from. For us, in a sense, when we say Naga food, then it's one way is to talk about the cuisine post 1997 that's happened, but it also then takes us a few steps back to understand about sustainability, about slash and burn, about season, and how is it that we understand Naga food in this wholesome, comprehensive way. This second part is very important for me as an anthropologist today studying food and also indigeneity, which is then connected to food sovereignty and the right to self-determination movements in the region that I have been chronicling and documenting.
You've mentioned Akuni a couple of times, and I think coming from the Myanmar side that this dish seems to play a similar role to ngapi in lowland Myanmar, which is that it's a fermented product that is incredibly ubiquitous and versatile, as I understand it, and is taken with all kinds of other foods. So I'd love to hear more about Akuni. Like, how is it prepared, and why does it always remind you of your grandmother?
Akuni is very important. Thanks. Look, now you're talking real food. So Akuni, for the listeners, is fermented soya beans, and it is one of the central condiments of the Naga people. We love it. And as you go up across the Himalayas, surprise, right? It is eaten by the Métis in the Imphal Valley. It is a beloved dish of the Nepali community across India, Darjeeling, Sikkim, and also across Nepal. They call it kinima. And this is really an important part of our diet, and it is also probiotic. For me, I would like to really talk about food and Naga food, not in a sense of, a community, a small community that's eating a particular kind of food, but to embrace a global lens and to look at that food. Often when we talk about indigenous communities, whether it's in India or other parts of the world, there is a pressure, right? It's to kind of talk about communities and what we do in a very narrow sense, or in a very, experiential sense. And I like that as well. I don't oppose that. But one of the important things that I think we need to remember as we talk about food, like Akuni, is to actually be able to link to global histories. In Melbourne, for instance, I buy this from the Japanese stores, where they sell special food. No Indian store would have this. The dry kind of Akuni, I buy it from the Vietnamese stores. So what I'm doing with my taste as a Naga anthropologist, looking at food as a very small part of our food called Akuni, fermented soya beans, constantly is also to have this global connection where I'm trying to understand. As I was exploring Akuni and Naga food, it led me, for instance, to look at the handbook of natto, written by Japanese scholars. It helped me to connect with a Japanese food writer in Melbourne who makes natto at home. It helped me then to connect with my friends, Naga friends here in Australia who make Akuni during the summer. The first person who told me that Akuni had a lovely fragrance, among other people, was not a Naga, but a Nepali that I meet in the foothill of the Himalayas in Siliguri. And I write it very clearly in my essay. The second person who helped me distinguish the taste of Akuni as something that's wonderful and tasty was this farmer sitting in Nagaland. And why am I explaining this to you or to our audience is that in my training as an anthropologist, if there's something that we can take away, it's really the power of storytelling and what we understand from that. And from that understanding, how do we connect it actually to the larger human experience and to our experience and our relation with nature and resources around us. And often in the way we talk about Naga food or even about Akuni, that part of the conversation is missing. And when that part of the conversation about people's history and season and sustainability is missing, what happens? What happens is the example that you gave of this wild fantasy about the casteist Indians' reaction to fermented food like akhuni. Very importantly, for majority of the migrants from Northeast India who go to other parts of the country to work, one of the top reasons why they don't find accommodation and housing is because of their food habits. And constantly this reminder that, you all eat stinky food, you all eat dirty food. And so in this sense, for me, when I was writing Fermenting Modernity, I wanted to go back to history. And when I wanted to go back to history, I went back to my own people. And when I went back to my own people, I went to memory that was with me as a child. And that's where my grandmother becomes very important in the storytelling process. My grandmother grew up during the wars, the First World War and the Second World War. And one of the stories that she told me before she passed away was her encounter with the Japanese soldiers who had come to the Naga hills. And she told me that this image of the soldiers quietly coming to our village and rummaging through the kitchen for food at night was very, very alive in her memory. And all of a sudden she said that if there's something she remembers was really Japanese soldiers crying and eating akhuni in my grandmother's kitchen. And for some reason, she told me this story many, many, many years ago when I was small. But as I wanted to write about food, this story became so important and it became so precious because both the connection that my grandmother had of the war, a very important period actually, both in colonial India and in the process of decolonization, because it's during this moment that a large part of the communities in the region that I come from, Northeast India, is also actually thinking about the right to self-determination. It's also thinking about their own history. And here it is, my grandmother passing down this story to me about eating akhuni, about the war, about Japanese soldiers. And today, what do I do with that story as an anthropologist? What I did was actually to make that a global story. I narrated this essay in Delhi during a conference, international conference, where a lot of Japanese participants had come. And in a sense, I was really surprised, not quite surprised, I would say, by their reaction. Because even in Japan, of course, there's such a denial, right, of the defeat, of the war, of the shame. And for them, for me as an anthropologist, to be invoking this memory of the soldiers, of their soldiers crying and eating this, they didn't know what to do. And one of the things they did was actually to avoid that story. But for me, it's important because it's part of my story and my grandmother's story. So perhaps in a way of maybe talking about akhuni and talking about fermented soya beans, it's this political moment for me that's important. And through this moment, and that's me as a storyteller, some people find it very distractive that through one lens, I'm able to show many stories. But I think that's who I am as an anthropologist. I did that in my first book. I did that in my second book. I did that in my third book. And this is the fourth book that I'm writing. And throughout all my books, one thing that I've done is that there's a chapter on food, right? So if you look at my first book, there's an entire chapter on the Hat Bazaar. The Hat Bazaar are the weekly markets. And I talk about friendship and I talk about resentment and taste. The second book then has a chapter on dessert and Naga people, right? Naga people trying to taste dessert in a high dining restaurant in Bombay and being trained as a waiter and being trained to adapt to Japanese dessert. But at the back of their mind, they're constantly missing Naga food. So I write about that mobility and that experience of becoming indigenous migrants. The third chapter, the third book that I write is also really about food. There are food all over. It's about the urban experience. And now the fourth book is really about my journey as an anthropologist and food as such, and how do I see that in itself is the span of, and it's the lens that I want to provide the reader about Akuni and really a global story, right? Because indigenous stories about food are not small.
they're not small, they can be so incredibly important. And we previously had Matt Wilkinson on the show who was talking about the state of Nagaland in India and how the state has changed since the most recent ceasefire, and about how some people in Naga society are more or less comfortable with the socio-economic changes of the last 20 odd years, and that there is some resistance to some of the changes. So I wonder about the politics of Naga food in Nagaland. When Naga people go out, they are discriminated against, as you said, trying to find accommodation and things like that. Inside Nagaland, since the ceasefire, has there been any kind of change regarding food politics? Is there an increased pride in Naga food, or is there an increased interest in other kinds of foods?
That's a really important question. Since 1997, what's happened to food, right? And I think you're on the right track in terms of even like tracing this puzzle, because we set the target in 97, and for me 97 is really a landmark year, not only for the Naga people but for that region of the Himalayas. For that region of the Himalayas, an extremely important point. When people talk about Northeast India and they try to ghettoize that entire region into, this is a regional place, perhaps not relevant to India. I always say that not only in India, but in South Asia, if you look at literature coming from Northeast India, it has shaped the intellectual and the political framework around how we think about sovereignty, how we think about insurgency, how we think about security, how we think about storytelling and survival after India became independent in 1947. It's from this region that conversations, stories, accounts, literature of human rights, of the right to self-determination, of mobility and migration came. And it's in this large context that I want to put food as such as a very important lens. After 1997, what immediately happened, was that because there was peace now, quote unquote, right? Because there was peace now, all of a sudden, because there was cessation of hostilities, the state came in big time and wanted everyone to become entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship, what does it mean? When you talk about entrepreneur and entrepreneurship, I really think about Silicon Valley business people and not poor indigenous people like the Nagas, who have been in one of the world's longest armed conflict, and in 97 get away, right, to think about their lives. And what is the state doing? The state is doing, right, let's make pickles. Quick. Let's have self-help groups, right? So that you can all turn your slash and burn, your June fields into monocropping. Look, what have you been doing? You have been doing slash and burn. Here you have pumpkins and chilies and you have brinjals, and then you have a part of the land to grow rice and other part of the land where you have banana, and then you have lovely yam. No, that's not going to work. Now that we are under ceasefire, what we're going to do is turn the land into monocropping. Right? Let's plant coffee. Let's plant tea. It's within this narrative that this entire shift takes place after 1997. In 2014 or 15, I wrote an essay for the Economic and Political Weekly called "Making Pickles During Ceasefire." And it shows how very big international donors like the United Nations Development Fund and others came in with that vision to say that, there's quote unquote cessation of hostility and there's peace. If there's something that the Naga people can do is to actually find an access to the market, right? Find a path to the market. And the way to find a way to the market would be by making pickles. Perhaps the intention was good, but perhaps the outcome was not something that communities like the Naga people needed right after ceasefire. What we needed was actually rehabilitation. What we needed was actually to recognize that this intergenerational trauma of the conflict was something that needed to be addressed. What we needed was that when the government of India sent our Naga soldiers into ceasefire camps, the relation with their family, because they were coming back from the jungle, had been fractured for decades. Right? What we needed, was to actually address how is it that the families of insurgents who had died during the conflict find a way to heal. After 1997, what happened instead was this push for development, was this push for progress. And if there's something we had, with us was land. If there's something we had with us was really this amazing indigenous knowledge and ability to know what to eat from the forest. I grew up knowing what ferns to eat, what ferns not to eat. I grew up knowing about the seasons. I grew up knowing that a particular season you're not supposed to eat certain animals. Right? These are stories that were handed down to us. After 1997, there was no recognition of any of that, but to immediately say that, okay, make a connection to the market. And the state government started giving, the central government started giving money, entrepreneurial workshops to so many people that, of course, there was a boost and there was a zeal. It's no one's fault, right? It's no one's fault. There was this hype that, all right, let's do this. One of the important things that the government of Nagaland took up was upskilling kids, upskilling youths from the village across the Naga homelands, including in the state of Nagaland. And they saw this migration, sending our kids as waiters, as security guards, high school dropouts. They saw that as the greatest gift they could give India after 1997. And it's really these kids who went to other parts of the country, perhaps, and started having Naga food in their ghettos. But coming back to the idea of food and representation in 1997, it was also this kind of microcredit madness that went. A lot of the stories I followed were actually ending up in failure. You have money that's invested in making pickles. Look, who's going to buy? You have money invested in making 1,000 packets of akhuni. Who's going to eat that? So on one hand, we have this craze that, oh, right, that's Naga food. But, in a sense, how do we connect with the market? And so the story of Naga food then is, after 1997, both are really a tourist fantasy that it's become. So it's good that it's available in five-star hotels, in a small plate. But really the ground story that I'm trying to build and bring it to you as listeners is to understand what happened with the connection to our land. Right? A couple of things happened, I'll tell you. The first is that the idea of representation changed. That means today what is Naga food and what is glorified and what is magnified is increasingly becoming an elite representation. So after the conflict, you see Naga elites who benefited from perhaps this conflict economy coming and representing what Naganess should mean. And Naganess then is where it starts entertaining this joker that you read out, right? From England coming on a tourist package trip, tasting a particular kind of a Naga world and going back and saying and thinking that it's perfectly okay to write about Naga people and their food in that fashion. Second, what happened after 1997 in food is the story of land and connection that I told you. How do we eat tea or how do we eat coffee? We have to sell those. Latin America is a good example for me as an anthropologist to see in terms of conflict economy and what happened to countries like Honduras who were actually forced to produce coffee. Majority of the migration that happened, youths leaving countries like Honduras to the United States, becoming perhaps like documentless workers, were actually part of this entire global story that I'm trying to tell and connect the Naga story after 1997. The third part of the story that's important about food, and that's also linked to land, then is about the loss of land that happens. Where do you grow food? At the end of the day, you grow food on the land. And what kind of cultivation and agriculture do we have in that part of the mountain? Look, we have slash and burn, right? It's very seasonal. Surely the ecology is fragile, but it's also a very different way of life. So all of a sudden, there's this hype that's going around and the government pushing for development, for land transformation, for changes, and mainly for monocropping. And so perhaps when we talk about Naga food after 1997, it's to make sense of this puzzle and this big story that resides. Should we eat local or should we try to package Naga food for the market? And if there is a market, where is the market and how is the market going to come?
Can I ask you about your documentary film? So what is this documentary film that you recently made? What's it called and how can we see it? What's it about?
Thanks for asking me about the documentary. All right. It's part of my current research on fermentation. I call it Fermenting Cultures. And the documentary is titled Seasons of Life, Foraging Bamboo Shoots During a Ceasefire. And it traces the story of tree foragers in Nagaland, the foothill of the Eastern Himalayas. And I try to show just a very, very small segment of their lives, of their everyday lives as foragers in a Naga village, and what it means to go to the forest, to search for bamboo shoots, to bring it back to the village, and to prepare it. The reason I wanted to do this was first to experiment with a different form of storytelling. As an anthropologist, I do a lot of writing and it's basically text. When I was doing this field work, I wanted to experiment what it means to tell stories with a different medium. But the larger story is actually connected once again to this idea of how do we tell the story of food, not only through celebration or through taste, but also in a sense through the everyday lives of the people who forage. And doing that also meant that as a Naga anthropologist, I chronicle the story of foraging. As you know, with the increasing pace at which deforestation is taking place, we are losing a lot of our indigenous food. And with that, we are also losing the stories of the knowledge keepers. We are also losing touch with what it means to actually even invoke a term like food heritage. And how do we make sense of our lives? You'll be surprised to notice, look, that after I made this short documentary, a lot of young Naga people, students, university students, school students contacted me and said, wow, we didn't know how bamboo shoot was made. We didn't know how it came to our plate. So more than anyone else, I think what really surprised me as an anthropologist was the reaction of the Naga people themselves, right, to this. I thought I was making it for the world, but it ended up being a story for the young Naga generation. And that really made me think deeply. And that really actually frightened me and shook me up as well. Because as much as we are pushing our young students and the future generation to embrace global terms like becoming business savvy, becoming entrepreneurs, we're actually, on the other hand, losing this entire wealth of indigenous knowledge and history right there in front of our eyes. I also find that the story that you read at the beginning of our conversation, a tragedy where this little girl is trying to explain it to the tourists that we don't eat frogs, but we eat tadpoles. And also perhaps this confusion that arises. Surely the English is language. This is a conversation that she's trying to have and explain our culture and what our food heritage is. But I think there's a lot of violence happening right there, even in that conversation. Bamboo is found everywhere across the Himalayas. Look, we build houses with that. We build baskets with that. Right? It is an integral part of our lives. From the moment you are born, the fine bamboo is used to actually, in a sense, right, cut the umbilical cord of the child as the child comes into the world. And as the child becomes a toddler, one of the first food that he or she will eat will be bamboo shoot. Beautiful, beautifully made, as fermented, as dried, as smoked, a bamboo shoot curry, and all the way to her or his or their adolescence, becoming an adult, becoming a mother, a father, an auntie, a grandfather, a grandmother, till the time of their death. Right? Even the funeral rituals we have, bamboo is so central. The coffin, the bamboo mat on which the funeral meat is cut. So I'm invoking these stories, look, not as a way of romanticizing indigenous way of life, but on one hand, through this 10-minute documentary, we see the lives that are so integral and part of a forest and foraging. And on the other hand, right, what is slipping from our hands? And so I hope that the audience is able to see. We will be putting it up very soon on the internet. There's a link also on my website.
Yeah, it's an interesting example, the bamboo shoot. I think how it's, when you think about the global and everything, the way that it's valued, it sort of has this position where you've explained, for example, the way that it is valued in northeast India by Naga and other people. And then you've also got sort of national cultures, like in Myanmar, it's seen as cheap food. It's sort of just not a very exciting food. It's like, why would you buy that when you could buy something better, kind of thing. But then in kind of global, or I don't know what you would call them, but there are certain discourses where it's like a superfood. I've seen it characterized as this sort of superfood, and people in rich countries pay a lot of money for it, and are experimenting with it because it's supposed to be very good for you, or it has this pure sort of mystique about it. At the same time, there's also a discourse about how it's not very nutritious. So it seems to go in so many different sort of.
You are right. You are right. Oh, look, I'm so glad you're sharing about this, because for me as an anthropologist, that's the amazing thing about food, right? We look at it one way, and especially to be talking about food in the 21st century is exactly what you're saying. Yes, the connections. Wow.
And then the other thing that I thought of there was thinking about the yeasts in Myanmar. So traditionally in upland villages in Myanmar, families and villages will take care of yeast that they use to create their alcoholic drinks, and they use the same yeast generation after generation. Sometimes they have stories about where they got their first yeast, but if they do, they're normally quite sort of mythical and in the distant past. And that is kind of like a generalization you can say about lots of the different people in upland Myanmar, that they've all had this sort of yeast fermentation culture. But it is disappearing because now, especially towards the border with China, you can go to the market and buy a packet of Chinese yeast, which is a lot more convenient than reusing the same yeast rings, especially if you don't have anyone in your village that is still doing it and you yourself don't want to do it. So this is a really tangible kind of change that's happening in the hills of Myanmar. And in all of my interviews, there's very little interest by any of these people in maintaining their, unique kind of yeast cultures. It's just not as practical. It's just one of these very straightforward things. Just, why would I do that? And when now I can just go and buy it from the shop. Yeah.
Wow, this is such an interesting story you're telling me, because even in my work on fermentation, the story of yeast is connected to the forest, because the making of the yeast, the starter for a lot of the indigenous communities was actually mixed with herbs, right? Was actually made into cakes.
Yep.
And as the forest is disappearing, as women and men become busy with multiple jobs, because a lot of them have precarious lives, they are trying to make ends meet. So they work perhaps in the fields, and then they go as sharecroppers somewhere, and then they also have to feed the family. The process of collecting the herbs from the forest also requires time and labor, right? So rightfully so, I think you point out a very important part about food and food cultures. They really see this as a waste of time right now if they can buy that packet of yeast from the market and they can do it. The second point that's connected to the story of the yeast is then also mobility. For the Naga people across the uplands, they have had to migrate. Right? Migration has been a very big part because of really the inaccessible landscape. A lot of families who want to have access to education or to health facilities or to trains, to buses, they come to the lowlands. And as you move from the village to the urban spaces, you also lose these food cultures. You also lose the ability to make starters. I just finished writing my book chapter draft on the story of this woman who makes rice beer in Dimapur and how she traces her family to a village in the uplands and how she grew up having the knowledge to make the starter yeast. But once she got married and came to Dimapur, it was just impossible to find the herbs. Right? It was just impossible to find that quality of the grain to make the starter yeast. And she said, forget about it. I'll just buy it. And so she started buying it. The second story that I encountered was about conversion and Christianity, because it's really a taboo. There's a big split among the Nagas between those who make and who drink rice beer as part of tradition and culture, and really the church's imposition on prohibiting and banning this immoral drink. This lovely woman, who is really part of a very lovely family, after her marriage was prohibited from making the starter yeast and at the same time brewing rice beer because it was really a non-Christian practice. I spoke to her daughter because her daughter also ferments, but not rice beer, fruit wine. Right. So in a sense, for the Nagas now, as we talk about modernity, as we talk about really hobbies, rice beer and our knowledge about that indigenous yeast is something that's shameful and we should be ashamed of ourselves and we should hide it. But when it comes to wine, fruit wine, and other kinds of lovely wine that we get, it is a sign of modernity. It is a sign of taste, right? If you drink wine, you develop a taste. If you're drinking rice beer, like the equation that you give to bamboo shoot, it's something cheap you're not supposed to do. But you're true and you're right that the story of yeast in itself really hides a very, very deep story about what we have lost.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point you bring up about wine, because that exact same thing is happening in Chin State in Myanmar, which is heavily Christian, and wine is really endorsed, and there's been more and more and more and more wine, village level wine production that is selling to very local markets in Chin State in the last 20 years, and less zoo, which is the rice beer being made, and a little bit the same in Kachin State.
So so I think in terms of the story about wine that I'm tracing, in Nagaland, it has to do with hobby, taste, and refinement. And among the young people, right? And also the yeast is easy to find. In Assam, actually, once again, the story of wine has to do with the plantation, with the tea plantation crowd, right? It is fun, and if you look at winemaking, it's also such a good way of looking at domestic hobby and connecting to that. The state of Meghalaya, let me say that in the northeast region of India, has actually looked at fruit wine as a state heritage liquor.
Yeah.
So if you look at Meghalaya, it is, they have something called the Cherry Blossoms Festival. So they sell a lot of wine around that time, big time into promoting wine, fruit wine. So if we're looking at this push for fruit wine in the northeastern region of India and across the eastern Himalayas, the states have come in big time. They're looking at really making the entire northeast region of India, along with many other things like big dams and hydropower, also making it a regional fruit destination. Well, the story is quite tricky there because once again, the trick or the difficulty of the market comes in. In some parts of the northeast, you have fruits going out of the region, but how they go? What's done? They don't produce it there. The fruit, the juice companies, the Indian juice companies don't come to the region to produce it. They make the fruit into slush, right? They make it into pulp and they package it and then they send it off by trains. Look, that's a very dangerous story because that's what happened to tea. In the 19th century, after the discovery of tea, that's what happened to tea. tea, in a sense, is auction, and the idea of taste and standardization happens in Calcutta. It doesn't happen in Assam.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So all of a sudden, actually, if we look at food, tea as food, and fruit wine as food in the Eastern Himalayas, there is a continuation that's happening. You can call it neo-colonialism. You can call it an enclave economy story, continued from the 19th to the 20th to the 21st century. But I guess as anthropologists, we are seeing this continuation of story, but what you and I know, right, in terms of the excitement about fruit wine and what's happening. So I'm very, very eager to tell that story in my book.
That sounds really... You've reminded me that I still need to read Sarah Besky's new book, because I think that is something to do with what you're referring to. I remember her earlier articles about value in the Kolkata tea market's really great.
Yeah, I have it there. I was reading it and I was fascinated. Such a wonderful book. Yeah, a shout out to Sarah Besky's book. Everyone, please, you have to read that.
Yeah, that's a good recommendation, and that actually brings us up to our last final question on every episode of Myanmar Musings, which is, Dolly, do you have a recommendation to do with the Naga or Myanmar for our listeners? What should they go and seek out?
All right. So in terms of my recommendations, please, if you're visiting India, try Naga food. It's fun. And along with that, I will also say that make sure that you know of our neighboring states, Assam, Meghalaya, Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, Tripura, Mizoram, Sikkim. Make sure that you know what friends are doing in Bhutan, that lovely part of the Himalayan region. Taste the food, taste Naga food. But if you just taste Naga food, not good enough. You have to know what is... Look at me, yeah? You have to know what is miso food, or you have to know what is Khasi food. That's how we roll together in that part of the world, all right? Okay, and 2 books that are very important for me that I would like you all to read. The first one is titled Aya's Account, A Ledger of Hope in Modern India. It's by Indiana University Press, 2014. And it's written by one of my favorite anthropologists who inspires me very much, Anand Pandian, in collaboration, listen to this, with his grandfather, MP Mariappan. And this book is about his grandfather's journey as a Tamil from Burma all the way to India, who makes a business there as a fruit seller and then goes all the way to the United States. And this is a fascinating account of the Indian and the Burmese journey during that very important part of the 20th century. The second book that I would like our listeners to get into is this wonderful book called Jangam, Jangam, Jangam. Okay. Jangam is written by Debendranath Acharya in 1982. It's an Assamese novel which is set in Burma and includes a large part of the Northeast. And it's about the story of Exodus during the war. And this lovely Assamese novel was translated in 2018. Voila! So it's available in English by this very lovely colleague and friend of mine, professor of literature, Amit Baisya. So please do pick up these 2 books.
That sounds really cool. It was great to chat, Dolly. Thanks heaps.
Bye.
Bye.